Goodness me, when we think of medieval life, we often imagine knights in shining armor and grand castles. But let's peek behind the tapestries, shall we? The idea of clean back then was, well, rather different from ours today. It wasn't so much about scrubbing your body until it squeaked. Instead, cleanliness often had more to do with your soul, your inner purity. People believed that being a good moral person was far more important for your spiritual health than a daily dip in the tub. So, while they might not have been reaching for the soap every morning, they were certainly thinking about the state of their immortal souls, hoping to keep them spotless for the afterlife. For most people in the Middle Ages, especially the wealthy, visible cleanliness was what truly mattered. Think about it. If you were meeting someone important, you'd want to make a good impression. This often meant having clean hands, a clean face, and crucially, clean linen at your neck and wrists. These were the bits people could actually see. So a crisp white collar or spotless cuffs could signal your status and respectability, even if the clothes underneath weren't quite so pristine. It was a clever bit of social signaling, a way of looking the part without necessarily undergoing a full, time-consuming wash every single day. This focus on visible freshness was a practical approach. Water itself wasn't always the friendly, accessible substance it is for us. Imagine having to fetch every drop you needed from a river, a stream, or a communal well. It was heavy work, and the water you fetched? Well, it might not have been sparkling clean. It could be muddy or worse, contaminated with all sorts of unpleasant things from upstream, like animal waste or runoff from tanneries. So the idea of using vast quantities of this precious, often dubious water for something like a full-body bath just wasn't practical or appealing for many. They used water sparingly, prioritizing it for drinking and cooking above all else, which makes perfect sense. So, the medieval mindset towards hygiene was a complex tapestry woven from religious beliefs, social expectations, and the sheer practicalities of daily life. It wasn't that they enjoyed being dirty, not at all. They simply had a different set of priorities and faced challenges we can barely imagine. Their definition of clean was tailored to their world, a world without our modern understanding of germs, or the luxury of instant hot and cold running water. It was about spiritual purity, presentable appearances, and making the best of the resources they had in a tough environment. It's a fascinating contrast to our own obsession with constant sanitization, isn't it? Now, this might sound utterly bonkers to us, with our lovely hot showers and bubbly baths, but in the Middle Ages, many people were genuinely scared of water, particularly of bathing too much. It wasn't just about the effort of getting the water, oh no. There were serious medical theories at the time that made people view a good soak with suspicion. Doctors, or rather physicians as they were known, often believed that water, especially hot water, could open up the pores of your skin. And what happened when your pores were open? Well, they thought it created an open invitation for diseases and pestilence to sweep right into your body. This idea came from the prevailing medical theory of miasma, the belief that diseases were carried in bad air, foul smells, and corrupt vapors. So if you were submerged in hot water, your body's natural defenses were thought to be weakened. The skin, softened and porous, was no longer a strong barrier against these invisible airborne threats. It's quite the opposite of our understanding today, where we see washing as a way to remove harmful things. Instead of feeling refreshed and clean after a bath, a medieval person might have felt vulnerable, exposed to the dangerous elements they believed were constantly swirling around them, waiting to cause illness. Public bathhouses, which had been quite popular in the earlier medieval period, a bit like a hangover from Roman times, started to get a rather bad reputation too. While some people did enjoy them for socializing and, yes, getting clean, they also became associated with less savory activities. More worryingly, as outbreaks of diseases like syphilis spread across Europe in the later Middle Ages, these communal bathing spots were, quite rightly in some ways, seen as places where sickness could easily pass from person to person. So, the authorities began to frown upon them, and many were eventually closed down, further discouraging the habit of regular full-body washing in public spaces. So, you see, it wasn't just laziness that kept medieval folk from their tubs. There was a genuine, medically backed fear that too much immersion in water could lead to sickness and even death. They believed they were protecting themselves by avoiding frequent thorough baths. It's a stark reminder of how scientific understanding, or the lack of it, can shape even the most basic daily habits. Instead of a cleansing ritual, a bath could be viewed as a risky gamble with one's health. Quite a thought next time you're enjoying a long soak, isn't it? They preferred a quick wipe down, if anything. Given the fear of water and the effort involved, it's probably no surprise that full immersion baths were quite a rare event for many people in medieval Europe. We're not talking about a quick daily shower here. For some, a proper bath might have happened only a few times a year, perhaps for special occasions like Christmas or Easter, or before their wedding day. For the very wealthy, who had servants to heat and carry the water, and private wooden tubs, bathing might have been a more frequent luxury, perhaps once every few weeks. But for the average peasant toiling away in the fields, such a thing was an almost unimaginable indulgence, and potentially a dangerous one at that. So what did they do instead of jumping into a tub? Well, most people relied on more limited forms of washing. A quick splash of water on the face and hands was common, especially in the morning. This was seen as sufficient for daily hygiene and for presenting a respectable appearance. Think of it as a top and tail wash. They might use a basin of water and a piece of linen cloth. Sometimes they might rub their bodies with a damp cloth, a sort of medieval sponge bath. This conserved water and avoided the perceived dangers of full immersion. It was all about practicality and managing risk within their belief system. The water they did use often came from less than ideal sources. Rivers and streams were convenient, but they were also where people dumped waste and where animals drank and, well, relieved themselves. Wells could be a bit better, but they too could become contaminated, especially in crowded towns. Imagine using water that you knew wasn't perfectly clean to try and get clean yourself. It's a rather unappetizing thought. There was no water treatment as we know it, no chlorine to kill off the nasties. So even when they did wash, the water itself could sometimes pose its own set of problems, potentially carrying unseen dangers. The social hierarchy played a significant role in bathing habits too. Nobles and wealthy merchants could afford private bathrooms, or at least portable tubs brought to their chambers. They might even add herbs or perfumes to their bath water to make it a more pleasant experience. For the poor, however, if they bathed fully, it was likely in a cold river or a shared wooden tub with water that had perhaps been used by several other family members already. This stark difference in resources and practices meant that experiences of cleanliness, even by medieval standards, varied enormously across society. It wasn't quite a level playing field when it came to hygiene. Oh, the little things in life. For people in the Middle Ages, some of those little things were rather itchy and unwelcome. I'm talking, of course, about lice and fleas. These tiny creatures were incredibly common, a fact of life for almost everyone, from the poorest peasant right up to the highest echelons of society. Yes, even kings and queens weren't immune. People were quite matter-of-fact about them. The word lousy, meaning full of lice, was just a common descriptive term, not necessarily the insult it is today. Delousing one another was a social activity, a bit like grooming in primates, picking the little critters out of hair and clothes. Hair care was, shall we say, minimal by our standards. People generally had long hair, both men and women. Washing hair was an infrequent and often arduous task, as it required a lot of water, and then the lengthy process of drying it without modern hairdryers. Women often kept their hair covered with veils, wimples or caps, which helped to keep it somewhat cleaner and also to manage those pesky lice. Combs, often made of wood, bone or ivory for the rich, were essential tools, not just for styling but for literally combing out lice and their eggs, known as nits. It was a constant battle against these persistent little invaders. And what about laundry? Well, put your modern washing machine out of your mind entirely. Doing the laundry in medieval times was a massive, laborious undertaking, usually done by women. Clothes were typically made of wool or linen. Wool, thankfully, doesn't need washing very often. It's quite good at repelling dirt and was often just brushed or aired out. Linen undergarments, like shirts and shifts worn next to the skin, did get washed more regularly, but regularly might mean every few weeks, or even less frequently for poorer folk. Imagine wearing the same underwear for weeks on end. It makes you appreciate your weekly wash, doesn't it? The laundry process itself was tough. Clothes were usually soaked in tubs of water, often with harsh soaps made from animal fat and lye or wood ash. Then they were beaten with wooden paddles or trampled underfoot to get the dirt out, rinsed in a river if possible, and then laid out on bushes or grass to dry and bleach in the sun. Because it was such a huge chore, people owned fewer sets of clothes than we do. They would wear their garments until they were practically falling apart, so clothes were often mended, patched and repatched, carrying the smells and stains of daily life with them for a very long time. Right, let's talk about a rather indelicate subject. Where did everyone, well, in the Middle Ages, forget pristine flushing toilets and scented toilet paper? The reality was much, much smellier and messier. Most ordinary homes didn't have private bathrooms or indoor toilets. Instead, people used chamber pots, which were kept under the bed or in a corner of the room. And when these pots were full, well, the contents were often simply tossed out of the window or door into the street below. You might hear a shout of Gardes l'eau, which means watch out for the water. If you were lucky, giving you a moment to dodge the flying filth. The streets in medieval towns and even villages were, as you can imagine, pretty disgusting. There were no proper sewage systems or rubbish collections like we have. Gutters, if they existed, were often open channels running down the middle or sides of the street, filled with household waste, animal droppings, offal from butchers, and all sorts of other muck. After a heavy rain, these streets would turn into stinking, muddy quagmires. People would try to navigate them by walking on raised wooden pattens, or simply by holding their noses and hoping for the best. It's a far cry from our paved, clean streets of today. For those who didn't just use a chamber pot, public latrines were sometimes available in towns, but these were very basic affairs. Often they were just simple wooden shacks built over a cesspit or a running stream. These pits could overflow, especially in wet weather, adding to the general stench and unsanitary conditions. In grander castles and monasteries, they had something a bit more sophisticated called a guardrobe. This was essentially a small room with a stone or wooden seat that had a hole leading down a chute to the moat outside the castle walls, or into a pit. A slight improvement perhaps, but still not exactly luxurious. And what about toilet paper? Well, that simply didn't exist. People had to make do with whatever was available and, disposable. This could include leaves, moss, hay, scraps of old cloth, or even for the poorest, just their hand, traditionally the left one, which was then washed. Romans had used a sponge on a stick sometimes, but that was a distant memory. The lack of soft absorbent paper is another one of those small daily discomforts that we rarely even think about today. It really highlights how different the everyday sensory experience of medieval life was, right down to the most private moments. Now let's take a peek into medieval mouths. A dazzling Hollywood smile? Not quite the norm, I'm afraid. Dental hygiene as we know it was pretty much non-existent. There were no fancy toothbrushes with ergonomic handles, no minty fresh toothpaste, and certainly no regular checkups with a friendly dentist. People did try to clean their teeth sometimes. They might rub their teeth and gums with a piece of rough linen cloth. Some used twigs, particularly hazel twigs, a bit like a primitive toothbrush, to scrape away food particles. It was better than nothing, I suppose. They also used various concoctions to try and freshen their breath or whiten their teeth. These could include abrasive powders made from things like crushed sage, rosemary, salt, or even powdered chalk or brick dust. While these might have helped to remove some surface stains, they could also be very harsh on the tooth enamel, potentially causing more damage in the long run. Bad breath, or halitosis, must have been incredibly common, given the diets and lack of effective cleaning methods. Imagine trying to have a close conversation with someone. You'd need a strong stomach. The medieval diet also contributed significantly to dental problems. While peasants ate a relatively healthy, if monotonous, diet of coarse bread, vegetables and grains, this bread often contained grit from the stone grinding process, which wore down teeth over time. For the wealthy, who could afford sugar and honey, tooth decay was a major issue. Sugar was a luxury, but its consumption led to cavities, just as it does today. Without fillings or proper dental care, a small cavity could quickly turn into a raging toothache, a truly miserable experience. And what happened if you did get a terrible toothache? Well, your options were grim. There were no anesthetics as we know them. Tooth drawers, who were often also barbers or traveling practitioners with little to no medical training, would perform extractions. Their tools were basic and often brutal-looking pliers. The process would have been excruciatingly painful, and there was a high risk of infection afterwards. It's no wonder that many people in medieval portraits look rather serious. Perhaps they were hiding a mouthful of missing or aching teeth. It makes you very grateful for modern dentistry. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the smells of a medieval town. It's quite an assault on the senses, isn't it? Unlike our sanitized modern world, where we try to eliminate most odors, the Middle Ages was a symphony of smells, and many of them were not pleasant. There was the pervasive aroma of unwashed bodies, as regular bathing was rare. Add to that the stench of rotting food scraps, animal manure in the streets from horses, pigs, and chickens, waste from tanneries and butcheries, and the contents of chamber pots being emptied into open drains or onto the thoroughfare. It must have been truly overwhelming, especially on a hot day. So how did people cope with this constant olfactory bombardment? Well, they tried to mask the bad smells as best they could, particularly the wealthy. Perfumes made from essential oils of flowers and spices were highly prized, though expensive. People might dab these on their skin or clothing. A popular item was a pomander, which was a small metal ball, often beautifully decorated, filled with fragrant substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, or dried flowers. Ladies and gentlemen would carry these pomanders, holding them to their noses when navigating particularly smelly areas, hoping the pleasant scent would overpower the foul ones. Another common practice, especially in wealthier households and public buildings like churches, was to strew fresh herbs and flowers on the floors. Plants like lavender, rosemary, mint, and rushes would be scattered around. When people walked on them, the plants would release their fragrance, helping to freshen the air a little and cover up some of the underlying stenches. In churches, the burning of incense was also very common, not just for religious ritual, but also to create a more pleasant and, they believed, holier atmosphere, driving away evil spirits and bad air with its sweet smoke. It wasn't just about comfort. There was a genuine belief that bad smells, or miasma, could cause disease. So, surrounding oneself with pleasant fragrances was thought to be a form of protection. Aromatic smoke from bonfires of fragrant woods like juniper or pine was sometimes used during plague outbreaks, in the hope it would purify the air. People would also carry small bouquets of flowers or herbs called nosegays or tussie-mussies to sniff as they went about their business. It was a constant battle to create a small pocket of fragrant air in a world that often stank to high heaven. The connection between poor hygiene and disease might seem glaringly obvious to us today, with our knowledge of germs and bacteria. But in the Middle Ages, people had a completely different understanding of what made them sick. They didn't know about microscopic organisms lurking in dirty water or on unwashed hands. Instead, the prevailing theory was the miasma theory. This was the belief that diseases like the plague, cholera, or dysentery were caused by bad airfoul smells, poisonous vapors, or corrupt air rising from rotting organic matter, swamps, or even from certain alignments of the planets. This lack of understanding meant that many of their efforts to prevent disease were, sadly, misguided or ineffective. While keeping towns clean by removing waste was sometimes attempted, it was often done to reduce bad smells rather than to eliminate breeding grounds for germs. Personal hygiene practices, or the lack thereof, directly contributed to the spread of countless infections. Contaminated food and water, unwashed hands preparing meals, and living in close quarters with animals and human waste created perfect conditions for diseases to thrive and spread like wildfire through communities. Think about the consequences. Diseases that are now easily preventable or treatable were often death sentences in medieval times. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and various forms of food poisoning were rampant due to contaminated water and poor food hygiene. Skin infections were common, and of course, there were the devastating epidemics like the Black Death, which wiped out a huge portion of Europe's population. While the exact transmission of the plague via fleas on rats wasn't understood, the unsanitary conditions certainly allowed rat and flea populations to flourish, exacerbating the crisis. Infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. Many children simply didn't survive past their first few years, often succumbing to diarrheal diseases or other infections linked to poor sanitation and hygiene. Without the knowledge of germ theory, people couldn't make the vital connections between cleanliness and health. They might blame supernatural forces, imbalances in the body's humors, or that dreaded miasma for their suffering. It's a poignant reminder of how critical scientific understanding is for public health, and how vulnerable populations are without it. Their world was full of invisible enemies they couldn't see or comprehend. Life presented unique hygiene challenges for medieval women, particularly when it came to managing menstruation. In an era without disposable sanitary products, women had to be resourceful. They typically used rags made of linen or other absorbent cloth, which would be washed and reused. Sometimes natural materials like moss might have been used, especially by poorer women who had less access to spare cloth. There was very little privacy surrounding these bodily functions, and menstruation was often shrouded in superstition and sometimes viewed as a state of uncleanness, both physically and ritually, in line with some religious interpretations. Imagine the daily discomfort and inconvenience. These homemade solutions were likely not very effective at preventing leaks, and the need to wash and reuse these cloths would have been an added burden, especially given the general difficulty of laundry. There were no discreet ways to carry or dispose of soiled items. This aspect of daily life, rarely depicted in romanticized tales of the medieval period, highlights another layer of the constant struggle for basic comfort and cleanliness. It's a very personal, human aspect of history that reminds us how profoundly different daily existence was, particularly for women who bore the brunt of these practical challenges. Now let's fast forward and consider how incredibly far we've come. Our modern understanding of hygiene is built on centuries of scientific discovery. Think about the monumental impact of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century, who developed the germ theory of disease. Suddenly, those invisible enemies weren't so invisible anymore. This revolutionized medicine and public health. Joseph Lister's work on antiseptic surgery dramatically reduced deaths from infection. These breakthroughs paved the way for the sanitation systems, clean water supplies, and personal hygiene products we take for granted. Today, we have soap readily available, clean running water at the turn of a tap, flushing toilets, effective sewage treatment, and a vast array of products designed to keep us clean and healthy, from toothpaste to hand sanitizer and sophisticated menstrual products. We understand that washing our hands can prevent the spread of colds, flu, and much more serious illnesses. Public health campaigns continually remind us of these simple yet vital practices. The contrast with the medieval world, with its miasmas, its rare baths, its lice, and its streets flowing with waste, could hardly be more striking. The scientific revolution didn't just change our technology, it fundamentally changed our ability to live longer, healthier lives, free from many of the daily discomforts and deadly dangers that defined the grimy reality of the Middle Ages.